So much for that wonderful introduction. It really is a delight for me to be here, especially to have something else to concentrate on in this difficult week we've all been. So something sort of interesting, I hope, and a reason to kind of press forward. So I want to talk a little bit about Haiti's history and how it sort of inspired me and compelled me to begin working on this archive, and sort of how I fell into it and what I think that we can learn, and rather what I have learned from trying to assemble, which really was kind of a process of disassembling, because as you will learn about here, each of these pieces that went into the archive was already archived somewhere else, but not in digital form usually, and not all together, which is part of the sort of problem that animated me to want to create the website that I'm going to show you. But so first, a little bit of the historical perspective, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is always the moment of truth when one never knows if everything's going to work out. So you'll let me know. See here. So do you see the second slide when I did that? Yes, okay. All right. So there are two major poles in contemporary discourse about Haiti. What Robert Lawless has called in his 1992 book of the same name, Haiti's Bad Press on the one hand, and the resonant opposing concept of new narratives, called for by scholars such as Gina Athena Ulysse, Kayama Glover, and Laurent Dubois on the other. So those of us in the field of Haitian studies immediately understand the meaning of bad press vis-a-vis Haiti when we see it. Notably, if it contains what Joel Dreyfus has aptly called the phrase, which I won't repeat. You can Google or think about it. Think about all the articles you've read in the mainstream media about Haiti. It'll be pretty apparent if you read even just a handful of them. It is much less clear, however, how we might go about generating new narratives in order to combat what Ulysse has referred to as the persistence of Haiti's image problem. In other words, how do we ensure that the new and alternative narratives we encourage, craft, and center to oppose bad press will in fact not generate similarly or perhaps newly hostile and harmful images of Haiti? And if you've read Voltaire's Candide, there's this moment where Candide, who's sort of supposed to be this optimist, says, if we do not find anything pleasant, at least we shall find something new, right? And so the newness is not the opposite of something that was already negative. It could actually be an extension, or it could be a different version of the same problem. So I want to turn then to 19th century histories of Haiti. So that's what I decided to do. When I first got into Haitian studies, I was reading a lot of 20th century historians, and I found the narrative so lacking. I found the tropology so repetitive. So I thought, well, let me go back and see what 19th century Haitian historians had to say about the revolution that many of them participated in themselves. There is a Haitian proverb that states, c'est vieux chaudier qui cuit bon manger, which means it's the old pot that makes the best food. And in the 19th century, this is really one of the last times that Haiti had sort of enjoyed a good press, to use that sort of imperfect terminology. And by that, I mean a press that sort of recognized their sovereignty and right to be independent. Now, that might seem contradictory because we would think that the press was overwhelmingly negative towards Haiti in the 19th century after the revolution. But what I have found is that actually it was highly varied, and it depended on where and who was writing. The French press, obviously, was against the Haitian independence. But in the US press and the British press, we find it depends on the paper, it depends on the period, the epoch, the writer, so many contingencies. So by good press, I don't mean analyses that refrain from criticism. I mean press that acknowledges at the outset that Haiti has a right to exist as a sovereign and independent state. And so part of that formulation is, are they calling it Saint-Domingue, its name under French rule, or are they calling it Haiti? Are they recognizing the sovereign of Haiti as Emperor Dessalines in the initial period, and Henri Christophe, a king, who we'll be hearing about later today? Or are they referring to them as generals, which was their titles under French rule? So although North American popular narratives and scholarship have tended to overlook 19th century Haiti, so the post-independence period, Haitian scholars have been studying and debating the history of their country since their establishment of an independent nation in 1804. So Baron de Vatte produced the first full-length national history of his country's path to independence in 1819 with the publication of his daunting essay on the causes of the revolution and the civil wars of Haiti. And so that's this middle one. And Professor Stokes's comment about the second book, that's the person who is the subject of that. Immediately after the revolution, Just Chanlat penned a short historical pamphlet titled A mes concitoyens, so that's there at the top, followed up by his lengthier The Cry of Nature. And then this would sort of become a formulation where Vatte would write The Cry of the Country or The Cry of the Fatherland, as it's been translated to, The Cry of Our Conscience. So these sort of formulations kind of proliferated in early 19th century Haiti. Then we have Louis-Félix Boisrontonnerre, who was Dessalines' most important secretary. He penned a short history of the revolution in 1804. That's the second one, called Mémoire pour survivre à l'histoire d'Haïti. Again, a sort of repetitive formulation, but this one drawn from some French memoirs, so to speak, of the French Revolution. Yet it was the middle of the 19th century that would see a true flourishing of Haitian historical and political production. Thomas Madieu published his 3-volume Histoire d'Haïti. There's actually 8 volumes total, but only 3 were published in his lifetime from 1847 to 1848. Then we had Joseph Saint-Remy. He took up the genre of biography, first with his Life of Toussaint Louverture, which would end up being translated into English and reprinted throughout the United States and England in the 19th century. He also penned a 5-volume work called Pétion and Haiti, Pétion et Haïti. And next there was Beaubrun Ardouin, who during the years 1853 to 1860, he'd already published a textbook, but he then devoted 11 volumes to the study of Haitian history with his Études sur l'histoire d'Haïti. And so that is this one here. So I sort of found that while, we had this concept of silencing the past, that actually what we had were a proliferation of materials, and that to understand the Haitian past, you had to sink into, so it was about who was sort of, in Michel Louvre-Trouillot's formulation, who was given the floor to talk, whose voices were amplified in those discussions, not about sort of the literal idea of silencing. Then finally on this list, I have Émile No, who with this work, Réclamation par les affranchis, is about the free people of color. So then he eventually published a book called The Histoire des Caciques in 1855, which is the last one on the list. And that is about the indigenous history of the island, both pre-Columbian and the moment of contact, and then all of the sort of things that happened during the conquest, including the opposition from the Cacique Queen Anacaona and her husband Kaonambo, and then their descendants in Henri the Cacique. And so this prompted him, when he was done with this work, to say, voila, all of Haitian history written by Haitian hands. So this became kind of the way that I structured my understanding of the Haitian past in terms of pre-revolution, the revolution itself, and post-revolution up through the 19th century, especially through the middle of the 19th century. So these 19th century histories of Haiti have, if you read a lot of Haitian scholarship, you might see Madieu, and you might see some Ardouin, but you won't really see most of these other historians popping up. And this is because until very recently, most of the scholarship on Haiti emanating from US universities traditionally concerned itself with US and Western European reactions to and readings of the Haitian Revolution, and especially with what Mimi Scheller has called the Haitian fear. Overburdened attention to Atlantic world anxieties about the meaning and consequences of the Haitian Revolution has come most often at the expense of analyzing 19th century Haitian interpretations of this history, and especially Haitians' own reactions and responses to US and European non-recognition of their sovereignty and the contributions of these historians to the field of Haitian revolutionary historiography itself. And so another thing that we learned through reading Haitian-produced historiography is that, yes, it's true that the United States and England and the rest of the world didn't formally recognize Haitian sovereignty until many decades later, but they continued to trade with Haiti. Their presses often referred to Haiti, reprinting its constitution, its Declaration of Independence. And so many Haitian writers said, de facto, they have recognized our independence. So we're keeping it moving, right? So they were trading, especially Great Britain was the greatest trading partner. And so the sort of obsession that they will come to have later in terms of France is not the same for every country. And with France, the reason they wanted French recognition was because France kept trying to send expeditions to retake their former colony. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about sort of how this legacy of sort of scholars not necessarily paying that much attention to 19th century Haitian produced scholarship has translated into the present day and has led to the sort of utilization of the archive that I ended up collecting on the website that I'll show you. So although the Revue de la Société Haïtienne d'Histoire, so that's the name of this organization, was founded in Port-au-Prince in 1925 and is without a doubt the richest source of Haitian-produced historiography about the 19th and the 20th centuries. As scholar Chelsea Stieber has noted, and this is her digital humanities project, the over 1,300 articles that this journal contains are rarely cited by US scholars. And so she created this indexing project. I'm sorry, there's like some weird, there's a weird URL there that I'll have to get rid of. But so she created this project to sort of bring more awareness. The Library of Congress has one of the only complete runs in the world, aside, I think, from the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, of every issue since 1925. But you know, you would have to travel there. She talked to the archivists. Do they have any interest in digitizing it? And ultimately, what they decided was to create this indexing project. And so if you were to go to this website, and the web address is there, you would access the article and you would see sort of annotations about what each one, rather than being able to access it. So you'd still have to sort of travel to the Library of Congress to get access. And the reason for that is the Société decided that they didn't want to digitize it at this time, because what tends to happen from their perspective is that North American scholars come and read their articles and then sort of Columbus it and write an article in English as if they discovered something new based on the information that is in these articles. And so for those of us in the field to listen to the perspective of people living in Haiti who've been doing this work but not getting recognition, not nearly as much as especially US scholars, is a moment that also sort of made me think about what is the role of community in what we're doing and in our scholarship, and making sure that we're in dialogue with. I'm of Haitian descent, but I don't live in Haiti, and I'm North American based, and so this sort of it concerns me just as much as anybody else. So without delving into Haitian produced sources about Haiti, I really do think that we kind of have this gap between what happened during the revolution, in between that moment and the US occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934. And when you look at the vast majority of English language books, for example, that are published on Haiti, they concern these two polar movements. And then now also earthquake is another moment where there's sort of a proliferation of texts. And so one example of that I thought was just so striking of this is if you look on your screen and you see the first image, you'll see that this is from the British Museum, and I'll explain in a moment. They did this, in some ways, very interesting exhibit on Toussaint Louverture, but they have this timeline on the wall, beautifully laid out. And you'll see here, they jump from 1825 to 1915, like nothing happened. So 1825 is the moment that Haiti is forced to pay 90 million francs to France as the price of recognition, King Charles X. And then we leap to 1915 to the US occupation of Haiti. Like nothing interesting happened in between here. You'll also notice that not just that, but here we went from 1804 to 1825, when the archive that I actually sort of gathered together, disassembled, if you will, concerns this period in the middle, which is a very interesting period between 1804 and 1825, when Haiti had a kingdom. And the only modern kingdom in the Caribbean, the first and last king of Haiti. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more, but I want to also point out that if you look on the wall here of the exhibit, you will see quotes from Toussaint Louverture, but actually what's in the cases are writings of foreign authors. They're not the writings of Toussaint Louverture. They're not that biography of Joseph Saint-Remy, a Haitian historian. You see the writings of the British and US authors who wrote biographies of him. There's also a poem, inexplicably, by William Blake, which I didn't really understand because it's William Wordsworth who has the famous sonnet to Toussaint Louverture. But I think it was partially because these were the items in their collection. And so they structured an exhibit about the end of slavery. They went and found quotes from Toussaint Louverture, which is great, but they forgot to include the works and writings of Louverture himself, and to include that history of how his memoirs especially circulated all around the Atlantic world. And these are, of course, the memoirs that he wrote after he was arrested in June of 1802 by Napoleon's army, deported to France, and left to die in a French prison of neglect. And before his death, he gave these memoirs to General Caffarelli, who had been sent to interrogate him so that he could defend himself against the charges of the French colonists. So these kinds of elisions, and I think really suppressions, because an elision on the face of it, it doesn't say what happened, and this is sort of active, even if it is not willful, has the effect of framing Haitian history almost entirely around its relationship to Europe and the United States. So what matters on the timeline is a break from colonial rule, a treaty with France, and occupation by the US. But I really think what we need to think about instead is a Haiti that's not overdetermined by its past colonial relationship to France or to its future and current neocolonial subjugation in the US and European world systems. I always say it's okay to study Haitian history because Haiti is a place like every place else. So Haiti is in crisis, but so many other places are in crisis and still get to sort of have the full measure of their history explored, without saying that what's more urgent is sort of the present moment. So as a corrective to such Euro and US-centric visions of Haitian history, for the rest of my talk today, I want to think about the way a digital humanities approach rooted in Haitian intellectual history and inspired by Haitian cultural practices might help us to tell capacious stories of a sovereign 19th century Haiti. So building on the idea I mentioned at the beginning that the 19th century is when Haitians were sort of in their most self-determining moment, what forms of governance they were going to have. We have a kingdom, we had an empire, then we have a kingdom, then we have a republic, then another empire under Faustin Soulouque, then another republic. So they are sort of in the reins and determining, they are holding the reins and determining the form of governance. So my focus is on Haiti's print culture, since in many respects, it is post-revolutionary Haitian political and historical writing that provides the key to understanding how sovereignty in Haiti unfolded and fell apart after the revolution. In his recent book, The Haitians, A Decolonial History, Jean Casimir uses the concept of the counterplantation, derived from the readings of Vaté, Ardouin, Madieu, and others, precisely to explain, in his words, how Haitians have survived and lived in the midst of political structures that exclude all participation on their part. His thesis, in effect, is that the majority of the Haitian people, the seeming victims of a world order based on capitalism, have created their own vision of the world in negotiation with dominant governments, including their own. Similarly, in paying attention to the myriad forms of documentation left behind by 19th century Haitians, but especially Haitian newspapers, I suggest that we can archive Black sovereignty together in a way that, in Karen Salt's words, will highlight Black politics alongside and within the structures of power that attempt to deny the presence and political agency of Black bodies. So even within this archive, we'll see that Haitians are holding the reins, but they're holding them against really very powerful forces. And that is when Napoleon is in charge, then when the Bourbon Restoration happens, once again, the first thing that Louis XVIII does is send an expedition to Haiti to try to prepare for a reconquest of the island. And here we are in 1815 when that happens. Ultimately, the goal of approaching the question of digital archiving methods using a Haitian-led practice centered on content, context, collaboration, and access allows for what I hope will ultimately, in the end, be alternative ways of narrating the Haitian past in a manner that does have the capacity to avoid generating further bad press. So in October 1806, General Henri Christophe, and what's behind me in my background is actually the Citadelle Henri in Haiti, which is King Henry's famous fortress that he built to prevent and protect Haiti from French invasion. So he was the provisory president after the assassination of Decolonization. However, shortly afterward, he fled the capital in Port-au-Prince to establish his own state in the north of Haiti at Cap-Haïtien. Meanwhile, his rival general Alexandre Pétion was named president of a separate republic maintained in the south. Early 19th century Haiti was therefore home to multiple competing printing presses, divided along political lines with one set of newspapers in the north and another set in the south. These presses kept alive a robust culture of print. The northern nation's first newspaper, La Gazette Officielle de l'État d'Haïti, would be initially edited by one of the country's earliest historians. I mentioned him earlier, the poet and playwright Just Chanlat. So everybody was wearing multiple hats. The politicians were poets, and they were also newspaper editors and writers of newspaper articles. But in March 1811, Henri Christophe established a monarchy and became king over the northern part of the island. And it is at this time that the newly baptized Northern Kingdom of Haiti renamed its national newspaper La Gazette Royale d'Haïti. And so these are the URLs if you want to check out the different things that I have. And I'm going to explain, I promise, in a moment, how I came to gather these newspapers together. In the course of my research on the history of early Haiti's Northern Kingdom, I attempted to gather as many issues as possible of both versions of the Gazette and the almanacs. I figured that was a natural thing to do as I'm trying to figure out what the inner workings of first the state that Christophe built and then the kingdom, what was going on an everyday sort of basis. I soon learned, however, that no single library contains a complete collection, and that the various extant issues are scattered in dozens of archives across North America, Europe, and the Caribbean. Not only of this, but of the issues and the almanacs that I eventually located, only one original issue of the Gazette Officielle, so before the kingdom, can be found in Haiti to this day. So that was an interesting sort of conundrum that I found, that the state of the papers, they varied from archive to archive, as well in terms of what kinds of conditions they were kept in, and then to find that only one issue of this newspaper could be found in Haiti today. This means that the majority of these rare documents, precious relics of early Haitian statehood, are mostly inaccessible to the Haitian people themselves. So that's what really struck me, was that whereas Chelsea Stieber was creating a project where she brought Haitian scholarship to a North Atlantic audience, to an Anglophone audience largely, that here was this scholarship that was rooted in Haitian history and life, and it was all on the opposite side of the world mostly, and very inaccessible. So with this project, we hope to repatriate in digital form these foundational materials of Haiti's early history and engage the public in the annotation, curation, and editing of these documents. So you'll notice that if you highlight something on the website, a little dialog box will pop up, and you can annotate it for your own purposes. You can keep your annotations private, or you can keep them public. And so one of the ways people are using the website is for genealogy projects, people in Haiti. The Gazette Royale project at present is a digital gathering of all of the known issues of these two early newspapers, the Gazette Officielle, Gazette Royale, as well as the 6 different versions of the almanac, the Royal Almanac of Haiti, issued during the reign of Henri Christophe as king. So in phase 1 of the project, which was completed in April 2018, we collected and transcribed the documents. That was the we being me and my research assistant, Denise Gross. We subsequently made them public on this WordPress site. Since we are not very technologically savvy, we put this on a WordPress site for now. The existing project has already been put to use by scholars and archaeologists who are studying the Palace of Haiti at Sans-Souci, now a World Heritage UNESCO site, and which stood as the ultimate symbol of Black sovereignty in the 19th century Atlantic world. So that was another surprise. I was surprised by the interest of genealogists in the project. And but I was even more surprised that archaeologists found evidence in the papers for when the palace first started to be built and when it was completed, and what the layout of the different rooms are, because the palace was partially destroyed, as you can see here from this image, in the 1842 earthquake that struck Cap-Haïtien. And then another earthquake later crumbled even more of it. This project is not solely designed to be an archive, however. It also proposes to take visitors on a digital journey through Haiti's early print culture by providing brief descriptions and commentary to accompany each issue. So some of the issues provide summaries of specific articles featured in that week's newspaper. Others call attention to important concurrent historical circumstances, and still others point out significant individuals, laws, literary elements, or changes of print format that might help guide readers in their own exploration of these remarkable documents. So it is an archive, but it's also a digital humanities project because if you go to Gale, Slavery and Anti-Slavery Archive, for example, there's 4 different parts. You have to sort of know what you're looking for, right? Because otherwise it's just a voluminous collection of documents and you couldn't read it if you tried for your whole life. And so what we thought with this is to give it sort of the maximum impact, people have to sort of know why they might want to read one of these issues. And so I had a medical researcher and doing history of science contact me because in one of the annotations, one of the headings, I noted that Haitians were being inoculated against smallpox, not the sort of traditional way that they had during the colonial period, but using sort of more modern technique that had come to them from Europe. And so, of course, if you're interested in the history of medicine, you might be very interested in that. And that the smallpox vaccine was brought by the New England abolitionist Prince Saunders, who brought a bunch of medical doctors with him, and they trained the Haitian doctors in how to administer this smallpox, this form of the smallpox vaccine to the Haitian people. So these are the almanacs that I was mentioning. So we finished phase 2A of the project, which was to provide full text of these 6 different versions of the almanac published in Northern Haiti from 1813 to 1820. They're between 75 to 140 pages each. So on the website, you can see the original PDF, or you can read a sort of transcribed version. And these list all the members of the nobility. They also have some essays that describe how the kingdom came about, and they contain the birth dates and the marriage dates of the king, queen, and their family members and brothers and sisters. So it's really is this kind of who's who in early 19th century Haiti. All of the nobles are here listed. So we're now working with the Institute for the Advanced Technology and the Humanities at UVA to develop an annotation system that will allow users to cross-reference the newspapers with data found in the almanacs and with information located in other online databases and digital reference tools such as Google Books. The bibliographer Ralph Esterquest, he described these almanacs as the Burke's Peerage for Christophe's grandiose kingdom. And they really are invaluable sources for the learning about the many different kinds of people who lived in the north of Haiti. And they're also, to me, invaluable because of what they don't say, and the newspapers as well. This is about the elite culture of Haiti. And you're not going to find much about the working and laboring class, the people who built the palace and the citadel, for example. And so to me, it's a silence that sort of speaks enormous volumes, a different form of silence, but that tells us quite a lot. So because a first step in creating this digital archive is identifying the many hundreds of people mentioned in the newspapers, we're going to go to the Association de Généalogie d'Haïti. We got to know a lot of genealogists, and they directed us to this repository, which is amazing. It's based on the National Archives of Haiti, and they have built a digital database that contains over 770,000 names. And so, and birth dates and death dates, and they're basically the civil record of Haiti, but put online and transcribed and searchable. So the ultimate goal is to create a digital index for the newspapers and almanacs so that if you were searching for a particular person, right now you can go to the search box and you can look for that person, and you can sort of go through all the individual pages, but this would be, you know, more standardized and you could see it in a chart and know exactly who and also the relationship to other people. And so just a quicker way to get the information, because with the search function now, it'll direct you to that page, but you'll still have to read through the issue or search through the issue to find the name of the person that you initially searched for. So there's a backstory of collaboration that enabled this archive and the vastly complex story it tells of early Haitian sovereignty to be brought to the public. Seven issues of the Gazette Royale were generously provided to me by historian Julia Gaffield, who shared the images she took with her personal camera at the National Library of Denmark in Copenhagen. So again, just to give you a sense of, they were really all over. They were in Ireland. There was one in Jamaica. They were scattered all over, and it took the work of a community to sort of bring them all together. A single issue of the Gazette, as I mentioned, was housed at the Institution Saint-Louis de Gonzague in Port-au-Prince, and that was shared with me by Paul Clammer. Tabitha McIntosh alerted me to 2 issues of the Gazette Royale held by the Bibliothèque du Port Royal in Paris, as well as to 15 additional issues available at the Library of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And the enthusiastic archivists who helped this and pushed this project along, I can't really thank them enough, because those issues at the American Philosophical Society were crumbling and falling apart. And the archivist made sure that they first went to the preservation department, that they were spruced up, in his words, and protected so that they wouldn't, I mean, they were falling apart. And they had a method that they could use to make sure that not just, you know, these digital versions will be available, but that the actual physical versions will still be around. So once I had the issues, the question became, once again, not only what to do with them beyond my own scholarship, but how to bring about further collaboration in relation to them, and more particularly, how to encourage collaboration with the Haitian people who I felt in Haiti, who I felt needed to be able to access them above all. One of the most important goals of this project was to ensure that these vital publications from the earliest years of Haitian statehood would become immediately accessible to people in Haiti. So minimally, this situation required that we commit to our chief goals, preservation and institutionalization, in a way that eliminates paywalls and provides open access for Haitians. Transcription and eventually translation. We have translated now the CESTA apparatus. So all the papers are in French, and we don't plan to translate those at the moment. But the site's entire apparatus, you'll see, is in English. So there's another sort of kind of barrier. If you know French, you can, and most Haitians, most literate Haitians do know French, so they can access them that way. But the site's apparatus. So we have translated the site's apparatus into French and Haitian Creole now. And so we'll have different versions that you can click on to change just the structure of what you're sort of reading to accompany it. So a little funny story about OCR. This technology cannot be, or at least it couldn't be at the time we did this project initially, reliably employed for accurate document transcription. So Denise Grosch and I transcribed without the use of this technology most of the drafts of the issue of the Gazette, and we used the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities at UVA helped us with the almanacs, which had not only diacritics, but also just sort of things that you find in almanacs, which are the phases of the moon. So all kinds of things that will further throw off transcribing, and asterisks to explain who people were in the era. So all kinds of different little characters and drawings as well. Collaboration in service of access, translation and transcription to promote international availability, and lowering the barriers of current provenance through the development of this website became crucial to us in our attempt to create what we hope is a decolonial archive. Achille Mbembe has written that decolonizing the university starts with the deprivatization and rehabilitation of the public space, the arrangement of spatial relations. It starts with a redefinition of what is public, he says, what pertains to the realm of the common, and as such does not belong to anyone in particular, because it must be equally shared between equals. Now, though Mbembe was talking quite literally about the buildings on a university campus, I think the comments function quite well when thinking about the provenance, sources, and ownership, quote unquote, of historical documents. In a very material way, I think we have to operate with a form of laku consciousness. A laku in Haiti is a place where multiple family members live on the same plot of land, have constructed multiple different forms of housing, so it's communal living. So this is a move that I hope gets us away from a logic of private property, which I think is I think is destructive to the profession. The idea that you find a document and you covered it and you hold it and you don't let anybody see it until you're done doing whatever you do with it, because your research sort of depends on it. So to sort of release that idea of the soul, of the importance of it to one person, and remember that it has a sort of broader role, and that you can still use it for your purposes, and have other people also be able to access it. And I do think that living collectively requires this, and also doing responsible, especially digital scholarship, requires thinking about the way that we're part of a public and part of a community. So empathy over monetization and decolonization over democratization requires that institutions and researchers alike work together to remove the many barriers that exist to accessing historical resources, which include not simply problems of language, ones that maybe translation seems to solve, but much more heady and material problems of financing. I'm struck by how many of these databases that we access as academics are very, very expensive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars our universities spend so that we can have access to them. And our counterparts in the global South often cannot access this research. Some of them can't access their own publications if they publish in North Atlantic publications that are archived by places like Gale and Cengage and that are creating these very expensive subscription models. These, I think, expensive and often inaccessible scholarly publications, to me, replicate systems of domination, exploitation, and ownership that so many of us rail against when writing about the machines of slavery and colonialism, but without thinking about how expensive it is to just conduct research on those topics itself. So that's where I say, it really was this grand kumbit, a sort of collective and communal work to gather the papers together, because especially at the time that I took this project on, I was an assistant professor at the Claremont Graduate University, and I couldn't have gone to Denmark, for example, to get those papers myself. So I had to rely on the generosity of other scholars. Because the fact that the vast majority of DH projects about Haiti come from the United States and England, this also means that we have some unavoidable power dynamics even on the DH side. So we have to recognize them and try to mitigate the effects of them as much as possible, which is why the model that Chelsea used with the review that I mentioned, where you talk to people, because it's owned by the Library of Congress, and frankly, they could do whatever they want. But this sort of cowboy attitude toward the World Wide Web is one that we're trying to, at least in Caribbean digital studies, rein in. The idea that just because you kind of located in an archive, you can just put it out into the community without collaborating with the community. So working collaboratively in this way must remain a hallmark of this project if it is to continue to work against the kind of imperial knowledge that has led us to the point where individual scholars, rather than a well-funded library or large pay-for-use academic database, performs this work of digitizing and contextualizing a newspaper archive such as this. The benefit to keeping this work in the hands of scholars rather than leaving it to a large company such as Gale or Redex is not only the open access that we can offer, but the curation necessary for these newspapers to have the most scholarly and public impact. This sort of public access and international availability is the most crucial project of this project's attempt to archive Black sovereignty, and that we must commit to not having a paywall sort of ever. And I have been approached because, of course, the way to keep it it's on a WordPress site, and those break all the time and can get bugs and all kinds of things. But working with various institutes at UVA, we'd rather archive it that way, create a new website for the project, one that will be sustainable, built on our own model, built on minimal computing, to use Alex Heel's phrase, rather than to not sell, but sort of say to Redex or Gale, you can incorporate it into one of their already existing models, which would then be a subscription base. So I want to return to the notion now of Haitian epistemologies and ways of knowing. So in Jacques Roumain's 1944 novel, Gouverneur de la Rosée, which was translated into English and published in 1947 by Mercer Cook and Langston Hughes as Masters of the Dew, the main character, Manuel, tries to convince the people of his small rural town to work together to end the drought. He tells them, we're poor, that's true. We're out of luck, that's true. We're miserable, that's true. But do you know why, brother? Because of our ignorance. We don't know yet what a force we are, what a single force, all the peasants, all the Negroes of plain and hill, all united. Someday, when we get wise to that, we'll rise up from one end of the country to the other. Then we'll call a general assembly of the Masters of the Dew, a great kumbit of farmers, and we'll clear out poverty and we'll plant a new life. So the kind of collaboration described in Roumain's novel has been traditionally undervalued, I think, in the US American Academy. And that undervaluation is reflected in today's humanities departments. This is not only in terms of preferring single author scholarship over translations, edited collections, and digital work, all of which is necessarily collaborative, but in preferring to exalt what Francis Smith Foster has called the lone fugitive, the singular sojourner, or the inspired visionary. Working collaboratively is a hallmark of Haitian studies, though, precisely because collaboration is a way of being that is deeply tied to Haitian culture and what Ulysse has termed a new Rasanblaj, or gathering together. Main en pile chai palu. This Haitian proverb roughly means with many hands, the burden is not heavy. We say in English, many hands lighten the load. In my own case, as you've seen, a great deal of my success with this project was accomplished through collaboration, the combit, the same kind of collective work that drives the narrative of Roumain's novels. It's my hope that the history of early Haiti, revealed through the story of its little-known northern kingdom, can help to counter the stereotypical rhetoric of poverty, corruption, and disaster that usually surges through public discourses about Haiti. One of the most important axioms of this project is that the annals of Haitian history do not contain empty pages waiting to be filled by scholars from abroad. As the newspapers and almanacs, as well as the myriad writings of 19th century Haitian intellectuals show, Haitians have been making and writing their own history, intellectual, literary, political, from the inception of the country until now. I want to conclude in part with an anecdote by David Nichols from his influential monograph From Dessalines to Duvalier. In his preface to the first edition of the book, Nichols quite ironically thanked Enoch Trouillot, the uncle of Michel Trouillot, but who was also the director at that time of the Archives Nationales in Port-au-Prince, and also a formidable scholar. He said, I want to thank him, quote, for his unintended kindness in refusing me to access the archives, end quote. If he had, Nichols writes, I would probably have been faced with such daunting practical problems that this book might never have been finished. Trouillot placed an immediate obstacle of access in Nichols' way. Maybe Nichols didn't have the right passcode. Haitians call Papa Legba the master of the crossroads, the arbiter between the living and the dead. And of course, what are you doing when you go into the archive is trying to essentially talk to the dead. So you're supposed to say, l'ouvri barrier pour moi. And this implores Papa Legba to open the gates. But Nichols had to make his own peace with this lack of access and move forward with the publication of his book anyway. And I think that that's one thing that I've learned, that we have to be unafraid of opacity, those moments when the archive refuses to speak to us, to make sense to us, or even to let us in, especially now when many of us cannot. Our archives are literally closed for most of us. The fact remains that for a variety of complicated reasons, most Haitian archives are not usually open to the general public anyway. So we must accept what it means to know infractions. It is very unlikely, for instance, that I'll ever come close to gathering a full run of the Gazette papers. You'll see so many issues are missing, and we know that because we have the issue numbers. And I know they existed at one time because I have British newspapers that reprint sections from them from the 19th century. Understanding, interpreting, and posing questions about those fragments we do manage to obtain will be entirely contingent not only on what the archive holds, but also on what it does not. We have to open our minds to partially knowing and perhaps to recognizing our inability to know everything. And most importantly, we must respect the fact that we do not necessarily have a right to this knowledge. Part of digitally archiving for the perspective of decolonization is not only making our work available and accessible to others, but also letting go of control, perhaps through collaboration, and letting go of perfection by allowing work to go out into the world in medias res. In so doing, we can take advantage of the ability the internet offers us, not only to publish quickly, but to revise our work constantly, to seek immediate feedback, and even to change the content and our conclusions when necessary. If I began this essay by expressing a sense of trouble about the way we talk about Haiti, I remain troubled. Archiving the sovereignty of 19th century Haiti is always going to be fraught, principally because what we are archiving lies in ruins. You see the palace there as well, but I talked about Haitian sovereignty earlier. Haiti remains in many ways under both figurative and literal military occupation. The UN just withdrew its troops recently, but they're not fully withdrawn. The memories of lost sovereignty hurt and are conjured up again and again when we study the history of early Haiti. I'm reminded of Césaire's resonant phrase, and the museums, it would have been better not to have needed them. No, in the scales of knowledge, all the museums in the world will never weigh so much as one spark of human sympathy. One way to work through this pain is to take it to the crossroads where the living and the dead, the colonial and the decolonial, have no choice but to interrogate one another. We're not going to get out of the conundrum and the power dynamics that exist between North Atlantic scholars and scholars in the global South. Drawing on the words of George Lamming from The Pleasures of Exile, it seems imperative now more than ever for us all to recognize that we are, quote, direct descendants of Prospero, worshiping the same temple of endeavor, using his language not to curse our meeting, but to push it further, reminding the descendants of both sides that what's done is done and can only be seen as a soil from which other gifts, or the same gift endowed with different meanings, may grow towards a future which is colonized by our acts in this moment, but which must always remain open, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dow, and thank you for that incisive and groundbreaking or path-breaking talk on archives and their place in our work. So I want to open it up for the Q&A. There were a couple questions in the chat. We want to start with them. And if whoever asks questions, you have a chance to ask yourself again if you want, or if you're not comfortable, we can ask them as well. So Kira Peacock had the first question. So if they want to ask, they can unmute.
Hi, this is Kira. My pronouns are she, her. And I was just, my question was about open access, and as an archivist, what we decide because of bandwidth and funding and time gets digitized and what doesn't, and concerns about whether we're just reproducing things that have happened in archives historically about, and museums about what gets kept or what gets presented in exhibits. So I just was really interested in your thoughts on that. And also I was a cultural studies student at CGU, so I was just a little shout out to you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I mean, so in terms of this particular project, the La Gazette project, we're trying to archive every issue of the Gazette that we find and come across. But it is true that in traditional digital archiving, there are decisions made about what gets archived and what does not that don't necessarily have that much to do with, they have to do with use, what people want to see. There's all kinds of decisions that go into it. And one of the things that we've found is that things might be archived for a time, but like not forever, or at least to the public. So the sort of idea that once it's on the World Wide Web, it's permanently there is actually not true. And in fact, a lot of early digital humanities projects have broken links or were put in platforms that don't have support. And so that's one of the reasons that it's imperative we move this archive off of WordPress, because WordPress is sort of the name of the game now, but that doesn't, Flash was before, and you know, these things have a shelf life. And so yes, I mean, I don't have an answer really, except for sort of agreement and solidarity with your question, because how we choose what we pick to study, or when archivists and librarians decide to archive, is just as fraught as what any physical book they decide to buy and put on the shelves. There's always some other book that's not there, and what is the reason for it? And ultimately, there are sort of guidelines that a library might have, but there's also individual subjectivity that goes into these decisions, and that we're not always aware even of what's happening behind the scenes, and the ways that our language is sometimes, and our thought process is sometimes replicating colonialist models. And it takes, you have to just, it's thinking about it a lot, and in ways that we don't, that are really difficult conversations to have. That also, in a different version of this talk I've talked about cataloging, which is also not neutral. And I have examples of projects where we really see that, you know, some of that language about Haiti in particular gets into the catalog, and it's hard to change. We petitioned the Library of Congress, and they finally did change voodoo to Vodou, the Haitian spelling, because voodoo with 2 O's or 4 O's has this different connotation and is not the same thing that Haitians practice as their religion. But it took more than a decade to break through. So it's fraught, I would say.
Thank you.
So for our next question, Veronica, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They have a question.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Goat. My name is Veronica Backus. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an alum of Stanford AAAS, class of 2018, and Stanford Anthropology, class of 2019. I wanted to piggyback off of that question, actually. This sort of selecting and forgetting that happens with archiving. And Ann Stoler talks about reading against the grain. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about, like, in your practice of digital archiving, how maybe are you helping people read differently or read against the grain and think critically about the archive?
Thank you for that. No, I have definitely been led by Ann Stoler's work, but also Black feminist theorists who say, you know, we have to read against the grain, but also sometimes we have to read along the archival grain because the archive is filled with rival and reciprocal energies, in one scholar's resonant words, that it's not enough just to read against the grain. We also have to figure out, well, what direction was the grain going in and why? And so again, even with an archive that on the face of it, like the Gazette Project, seems like a post-colonial, decolonial archive, as I mentioned, this is from the literate elite top of the socioeconomic status in Haiti. So I need to read it to figure out what was happening, but I also need to read against it constantly. You don't see, one thing I noticed in the almanacs almost immediately was that even though they claimed they wanted to be like British royalty, like British aristocracy, the nobility was modeled after the French, except that women didn't have titles really. Only the wives of the super high, like the princes and the kings and a few of the barons. But unlike in British or French royalty, where you have duchesses and countesses. So what does that tell me about the role of women even in this society? And so many things are not there that are telling me so much. So yes, we have to not, even when we're dealing with an archive made by the people who we're quote unquote studying, we have to remember that there are still biases and silences in there, and learning how to read those, which is why I say it's sort of like disassembling also, because I want to know, but I know that I'm only knowing certain things. I'm still only knowing what the people who wrote this down wanted me to know. And that is sort of like, it's hard to hold all of those things together sometimes because it's not a colonial archive, but on the face of it, it itself is not decolonial just because it was built in 19th century Haiti, if that makes sense.
If there are other questions, you can raise your hand or unmute. So I actually had a question. And so the access and the accessibility and increasing it is definitely an important one for peoples who don't have the resources that, say, scholars here at Stanford or elsewhere may have. But I also want to ask you about how you view this work within still the larger movement of repatriation and repatriation. And as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, our archives were completely taken by the state of Oklahoma during statehood. So having all those archives online will be useful, but how does that also work within we want those documents back?
Yeah, I mean, it is to me one of the most urgent questions of our time as we watch. And this is why I say I appreciate the multiple crises that we are facing across the world, and climate crisis, so many things. We have so many crises, but this question of how we understand and preserve and have respect for the past, to me, is not separate from the current and present moments that we're living in. And I feel like it is a danger to see them as unconnected. And to me, it's also disrespectful because it suggests that people who want these objects back, that they're not focused on what is important, when these are questions that are central to how various communities understand themselves. And so, yes, while digital repatriation has offered, it's not just, there's another project, the Radio Haiti archive if you're interested in a sound archive, but it's housed at Duke. The tapes, the physical tapes are there, but it's on SoundCloud and it's on YouTube. And so people in Haiti, they've distributed USB discs and CDs and stuff all around Haiti for people who don't have an internet connection to make it more accessible. Even little recorders that are just have their own sort of, it's just all contained. But at the same time, the physical objects, that means that Duke owns it. Even with an archive like mine, one of the reasons we have to do something that's even more sort of permanent with it is because it can't depend on one person either. It can't, like one person's existence in this world or at a certain university. And so I think the repatriation of objects from museums, the British Museum display that I showed, they had, if you look to if you kind of Google it and look it up, they had a drum, a Haitian drum that was captured by US Marines during the US occupation. And they acknowledged that in their exhibit, but it's also like, you're still putting that on display and keeping this object to, in the name of educating mostly people in Great Britain about Haiti, but at the same time, this is like a sacred drum used in Vodou performances. So yes, I think we still have to work towards, we can do all of the things, I think we should. I know that it saddens the archivists in Haiti that they have one issue of the paper, for example, like it's a huge problem. And the Declaration of Independence, the only official printed copy that we knew of at the time from the Haitian printing press being found in the British National Archives was also devastating for Haitians, and the Haitian government has repeatedly asked for the National Archives of the UK to return the document. And they're like, we put it online on our website for free. So that is just to say, again, solidarity with you, but I don't have another answer other than we have to work at both things constantly and keep pressing and pushing, because we see that pressing and pushing does work in certain instances. It worked with the remains of Saartjie Baartman, the quote unquote Hottentot Venus, the remains were returned to South Africa, even though the French archivist said no initially, citing like, we don't know what the South Africans will do with it, which is also another kind of patronizing way that these big institutions decide that they need to remain in charge.
Thank you. And if I know Professor Cesarani and Professor Stokes had a question, but I think Jasmine Mulliken actually just posted one in the chat if she wants to ask it.
Hi, yes, I'm Jasmine Mulliken. I work at the Stanford University Press on the Digital Publications Initiative, and my pronouns are she and her. And first, I just want to thank you for this thoughtful presentation. And I was wondering a little bit more about your preservation plans. So even if this project is migrated to a more minimal non-WordPress format as a next step, what kind of archiving of the digital project is being considered? So have you looked at all into like web archiving or emulation or storage of at least the data and the PDFs of these files in an institutional digital repository?
Yes, definitely. And actually, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because one part that I took out of the talk was about how I was contacted by a Haitian publisher. So here I am thinking, this project is on the web, and now we have not solved a problem, but we've made this very, very accessible. And he came up to me after a conference where I presented on this project in Haiti. And he said, I would like to publish your website basically as a book. I would like to gather, if you could give me all the doc, and he said, because the best way to reach Haitian students in Haitian universities is with books. Like that's the best way for us to get this information to them. And, I sat and thought about it, and I thought, what is a great technology? The book, because we go to libraries and there we have books from the 13th century, from the 12th century. And so to me, we are exploring other digital options with the sort of the text and the PDFs and all of that as well. But I do think that one way it will be not in its dynamic form, because the benefit of the website is we can keep updating it and adding issues as we do continue to find them. So the book will end up being a more static version of it as it was the snapshot when I gave him the files in October 2020, as the website was then. but it will have the benefit of being able to be archived by the Library of Congress, by the Haitian National Archives, in libraries around the world, which we found that's where most of these documents were. They were hiding in plain sight. Many of them were miscatalogued. Every Haitian newspaper says at the top, Liberté ou la mort, after a certain date. So many of those newspapers were cataloged as Liberté ou la mort because you know, if you didn't know and they got them in like the 1920s and you said, oh, that must be the title, Liberté ou la mort, you know, instead of Gazette. And so whoever was doing it quickly, probably in a batch, put that there. And so we want to look at multiple ways of access, because the book is also a question of access. And it's going to be in 2 languages. It will be in French and in Haitian Creole, the apparatus. But also at what are some of the things like Wayback Machine, which of course we're already in, but also archive.org, and making sure that we find an institutional home also for just the PDFs and our original transcriptions, and basically what's here, basically a sort of almost, you know, print version of what is actually here on this website. But thank you for that.
I think Christina Hodge had a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this. It was really a really wonderful presentation, and I want to express appreciation for the way you're considering not only the public forward-facing components of this, but the back end, right? The data and the metadata and the sustainability, because you don't always see those, although I think they really work together in an important way. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, especially about, you mentioned the Library of Congress and how hard it was to get them to change their lexicon around this. And that's something that I know others have been struggling with. I take care of a global, but also largely North American indigenous collection of material culture. And so for us to authorize the terms we use and find a way to balance that is proving challenging. So I was really curious about that.
Yes, so the scholar who was working on that is, her name is Laura Wagner. I'm going to type it into the chat. And she's of the Radio Haiti archive, because she has written actually 2 articles where she mentions this, and one she gets more into it than the other one in terms of, because it wasn't just that one term, as you can imagine, there were multiple terms. And because she was doing a much more traditional archival project through the Duke libraries, they needed to use the LOC classifications, whereas I can use whatever I want and make up my own terms. I'm not beholden to, because hers was much more institutionally based. So I do think that I think that sort of was how, when I was thinking of this project, it was kind of like the example of what we don't want to do. We don't want to use the LOC classifications, and we want to, and what we opted for instead was to do sort of very fine-grained descriptions of what is in what are in the individual papers instead of headings, which almost function like tags. And so one of the things you'll note, we don't have really tags other than what our users have put in. Our users have tagged certain things and places and people. And in the end, I don't know necessarily if one way is better than the other. I think tags are good, and also really kind of fine-grained descriptions are good as well. But I do wonder sometimes if tags mean that when we're doing this kind of quickly and needing like a short phrase or word, that leaves us more open to like some of the pitfalls or like repetitions, because some of the stuff is really actually needs a lot of nuance. For example, like in some LOC classifications, you would find like a Haitian ruler mentioned, and it would say like despot and tyrant. And I'm like, who writes that for, like, you can't, like, how come no US presidents have despot or tyrant after their name in the LOC, right? So like stuff like that is hard to change. And in fact, it's not just the LOC, we collectively at Haitian Studies tried to change on multiple occasions the entry for Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and somebody changes it back immediately every time we do it. And I would it to me is the biggest enigma, because I'm like, who, does somebody get an alert? Like, does somebody have this set up so they get an alert? So we have multiple strands in our digital landscape that we're working with in terms of combating the language that seeps in, because Wikipedia has told us we need these kinds of sources in order to change the Wikipedia page. And then, you know, people cite Wikipedia, and that it's like a mutually informing relationship. They pull the information from Wikipedia, Wikipedia pulls the information from them. So, yeah, so that I think it's an ongoing battle, but I do think it is another worthy battle in the sense of like how influential, as we see, the digital is. It's worth taking on.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that.
I think we have time for one more question. Chloe.
Hi, Professor Dot. Thank you for this incredible talk. I was blown away by what I think.
Can't hear.
Oh, can't hear me?
There, I can hear a little bit better now.
What about now? Is that better?
A little bit, yeah. I turned up the volume so I can hear you.
Thank you, Professor Dot, for your talk. As somebody else in the chat said, I'm totally join them in being blown away by your praxis. This is brilliant, just even in its conception. So congratulations to you and your team. I was curious, so I came across your work when I was thinking of how to integrate fiction from Haiti on Haiti onto a literature syllabus. I am a PhD in comparative literature here at Stanford, and my pronouns are she, her. And I came across your website, Haitian Revolutionary Fictions, which I, understanding from your talk, is sort of the same host as La Gazette Royale. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering how literary archives work or sort of figure within your greater project, if that sort of genre category is important in your conception of the project, to the end. And the conclusion for me, and sort of hopefully it's useful for somebody else on the call, is how to like take you up on your offer to use this archive in our classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, I would say literature, because that was the first website that I ever made, was that Haitian Revolutionary Fictions website. So you can tell I had no idea what I was doing, and it was really just because I had wanted it to be an appendix to Tropics of Haiti, but as those who were in the reading group and just read it know, that Tropics of Haiti is long enough already. So the publisher was kind of like, we have to cut something out in the appendix with this like long bibliography of the works, like in, you know, alphabetical order and or in chronological order or by nation, you know, or all three was the thing that had to go, but that I've picked up again with the anthology. And so that is, again, it was a project that I initially conceived of like, well, I wanted this to be a part of it so that people would know how many fictions of the Haitian Revolution there were, because it wasn't just this isolated phenomenon, it wasn't a 20th century phenomenon, and that the 19th century fictions of the revolution are very different from the 20th century. Most of the 20th century fictions are celebratory. They're like Langston Hughes and C.L.R. James plays, and most of the fictions of the 19th century are for pro-slavery ends, and they have gruesome accounts, and the purpose is to show how terrible the Haitian Revolution was. And in fact, that became the primary way that news about the Haitian Revolution circulated. And it became, there wasn't a huge distinction. And so putting it online to me was a question of accessibility. But the anthology is something that allows for greater accessibility, because one thing why I mentioned this slavery and anti-slavery databases through Gale is that large repositories, because those are repositories, really not digital humanities projects. They are archives, but really they are repositories because it's everything that was in a certain archive with no context at all, but tagged, and you can search it. And that to me is what it felt like we would be doing if we put the all the fictions online was because many of them are available in 18th century collections through your library or 19th century collections. And so it became more important to do a little translation project, pull out the excerpts and make that available for teaching. So that book's actually coming out in October of 2021 with the UVA Press. The title's a little different now, Haitian Revolutionary Fictions, an anthology, but it's over 200 excerpts from fictions that were written in English, French, there's one Spanish, a few Brazilian Portuguese, and like a few dozen German texts as well, German language texts. And so I see the digital and the kind of analog, if you will, in a constant interplay. And that was a project that really we felt like needed something beyond the digital. But another project related to it are all the images that are in those books, which are very different from the kinds of images that if you just searched through various other repositories you'd find on the Haitian Revolution. And that seems like a project that's very apt and ready for digitization. And so that's what I always say, I have a lot of students come to me and say, I want to do like a digital project. And it's making sure that the project matches the goals of what we're doing in digital humanities, because not everything needs to or can be a digital humanities project, just like not everything needs to or can be a book, if that makes sense. And again, that bibliography grew out of the idea that actually it was better to have a bibliography that's online, because since the time of Tropics of Haiti, I have located at least 3 or 4 dozen more fictions. When I made the website, I was at 150. I think I'm now at 215. So, and that would have just been a static thing that couldn't grow and change. So I think just really thinking about like what we're doing when we create a digital project. And we say this in our scholarship, like, why do we need this article? Why do we need this book? But why do we need this digital project is, I think, a really good question that we should continue to ask.
Thank you, Professor Dowd, so much for joining us. I think that's all the time we have. So if we can all give a virtual applause.
Thank you, everybody. It was my pleasure to be here and to virtually see you all.
All right, thank you. And I encourage everyone who joined to stay tuned for more CESTA events later this quarter.
Bye-bye, everybody.